Welcome to episode 8 of Action RPG game in Unity, Essential Scene and Scene Transition. Good, today we want to separate our scene into two scenes. One will represent the essential scene, another will be the actual gameplay environment. The essential scene will contain all the essential elements for your game to function. Think about everything what needs to be present at any state of the game in the gameplay. For example, our character, because we will be navigating world with this character. Meanwhile, the environment scene will have only relevant elements for the environment our character is currently exploring. If we don't have enemies, we don't need to have an enemy controller on that scene, for example. So let's create a new scene called Essential Scene. Let's load the other scene additively. This will make both essential scene and sample scene to be loaded at the same time. Do this by dragging the sample scene into the hierarchy. As you can see, now both scenes are loaded at the same time. Let's rename sample scene into test area 1. Delete unnecessary objects from the essential scene. And now we will migrate all the essential elements into the essential scene from the test area. Game Manager, Main Camera, Player Character, Camera Scene Machine, Event System, and the UI canvas. Good. If we launch the game now, everything should work just fine. We have a problem with enemy AI. We will fix it in later episodes. For now, let's disable the AI. And let's remove this weird empty debug log. Good. Now we have the test area environment and essential components separated into two scenes. So essential scene should be present at all time in the gameplay because it has all essential components for gameplay. Now we want to refactor our input, so we will be able to move the character and interact with the environment. Right now in the character movement input and in the attack input, we have an input from the player, which make it overlap between attack input and movement input, causing them acting inconsistently. What we want to do is to isolate a processing input into one component, which go and pass its data to the interact, attack and move input, more specialized input components. On the character, let's create a new component called player character input. Inside, let's create serialized field for mouse input. And cache the reference to the interact input, move input and attack input. reference the mouse input. Good. Now in the player character input. So this script will centralize the input from the player and then be calling the smaller input components. Let's start by implementing character movement input. Inside, create a new method called moveInput. Where we will set the destination for character movement based on the mouse position. Now we need to call this moveInput from the player character input. Let's test this. Good, our character can move around. And now we want to add the attack into player character input. Because attack will take a priority over movement, so when player hover over the enemy and click, we should process only the attack instead of doing the movement too. So inside attack input, create attack method. And we need to create a new method called attack check, which will check the input of the attack input. If this method return true, that means our input, which we receive, is being done to attack some object on the scene. And we need to call attack input. In the player character input, we need to check if the input is delivered with intent to attack an object on the scene. We just made a method for this called attack check. If attack check returns true, meaning our player is trying to attack the enemy on the scene, we call attack and return to stop the execution, so the move input will not be processed. To demonstrate the point, let's add two debug messages for attack and for move. Let's test this. As you can see, if I move around, only the move command will be called, and if I attack, only the attack command will be called. And now we need to introduce same thing, but for interact object. But because we want the interact input be less in the priority, so in the heat of combat you don't want your player clicking on item to pick up when they overlap with the enemies, we will place interactable objects below the attack input calls, but above the move input, because move input is lower in the priority than interact input. Good. Now if I click on interactable object, I will get an interaction. If I click on enemy, I will attack him. And if I click anywhere else, I will move to that position. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. You will get cool perks like being featured like those people you can see on screen right now. Good, now let's introduce scene switching. It's actually not that complicated to do. First select Game Manager and create another new component called Game Scene Manager. Scene Manager will be responsible for managing the gameplay scene. Inside, let's make it into singleton so we will be able to easily call it. First we need to determine the current active gameplay scene. To make it easier to test, let's mark the current scene as a serialized variable, so we will be able to see it in the inspector. Then on start, cycle through all the active scenes. And check if the name of the scene is not essential. Then this means the scene is our current gameplay scene. Make double sure that the spelling of essential is the same as your essential scene name. Inside the condition we must put exactly the same name as our essential scene. Then read the name of the scene and store it into variable. Good. If you set up everything right, you should see test area as your current scene. Now we want to describe the process of transition to a new scene. It will be done by coroutine. So create a new coroutine method called transition with parameter called toSceneName. And method called switchScene with parameter toSceneName. This parameter is the name of the scene we're transitioning towards. Good, inside the switch scene we want to initialize the load and unload of the scene. This is done through async operations. So create two variables of async operations, one for loading and one for unloading. Inside switch scene, call load scene async and start loading the scene we are transitioning towards. Make sure you set it to be loaded as additive scene, so it will exist parallel with essential scene. Meanwhile, start unloading the current scene. And because we are transitioning to a new scene, we need to mark this new scene as our new current scene. Now inside the transition coroutine, we need to call switch scene. And now you need to wait for the new scene to load and old scene to unload. So while load and unload is done equal false, we wait for the completion. and by the time you are done waiting, nullify them. Good. One last thing we need to do is initialize the coroutine somewhere. So create public method called start transition and call start coroutine transition. Let's go back to Unity. Let's say this new interactable object is a transition portal or something. You know, object you click to transition to some other place. So let's create a new scene, which will be this some other place. Make the plane, let's make it different color. And bake the navigation. Good. Go back to the test area 1. Remember when we are playing we want to first load the essential scene and then add the gameplay location as an additional scene. Select the transition object. And in the interactable object, when we interact, we will use post message as a transition scene name destination. This is just for testing purposes. We will redo it in the next episode. Select the transition object and in the post message write test area 2. Once again, because we are using name, make sure the spelling is exactly the same as your second scene. Let's disable the other interactable objects to avoid possible errors. Let's test this. If I click on the transition object, I will be teleported into nowhere. We forgot to add the new scene into the build order. Now this should work. Good. In the next episode we will be improving the interactable objects and start working on combat more in depth. Good, this is it for this episode. Special thank you to Andrew Willong, Fari PC, Zisol Hdu and LP Massive for their generous support. With best regards, see you in the next episode.